Good evening. My name is Keener Tippin, the immediate past co-chair of the Kansas State University Martin Luther King Jr. Observance Week Committee. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's University Distinguished Lecture to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Few have had as much of an impact upon American consciousness as the late civil rights leader we have gathered tonight to honor. I'm sure I speak for the entire MLK Observance Committee when I say that we are proud to be partners with the Dorothy Thompson and the Lou Douglas Lecture Series in this event. Separate and substandard drinking fountains and bathrooms from whites, colored balconies in movie theaters, seats in the back of the bus, soldiers dispatched to protect children trying to attend school. For many of the younger members of our audience who perhaps take these things for granted, it may be difficult to believe these were examples of conditions in America a mere 40 years ago. Although others went before him and fought alongside him during the struggle to change these conditions, it was Dr. King who was thrust into the forefront of a movement to win equal protection under the law for citizens of all races, a struggle that ultimately cost him his life. Annually, the Martin Luther King Jr. Observance is a time of remembrance of Dr. King and honors his legacy, contributions to our nation's history, to the civil rights movement, and to the cause of social justice. This time also serves as a focal point for encouraging improved race relations. While the first national observance of the King holiday was celebrated in 1986, K-State began its observance of the slain civil rights leader in 1985. Poet and Topeka native Gwendolyn Brooks was the first keynote speaker to highlight that year's observance. Past speakers have included Benjamin Hooks, former executive director of the NAACP, Lerone Bennett, executive editor of Ebony magazine, Beverly Harvard, chief of police of Atlanta, Georgia, educator Cornel West, Representative Eleanor Holmes Horton, Arthur Fletcher, former chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and professional orator and attorney Patricia Russell McLeod. Tonight we are gathered to honor Dr. King and his legacy, and the legacy of those who have gone before us in what we like to call the struggle, through a message brought to us by a true keeper of the civil rights flame, passed on by Dr. King, Harvard University Law School professor, author, and civil rights activist Lani Guinier. We hope you will not only enjoy Ms. Guinier's message, but that you reflect on the legacy Dr. King has left all of us. Once again, on behalf of the MLK Observance Committee, the University Distinguished Lecturer, the Dorothy Thompson, and the Lou Douglas Lecture Series, I welcome you. Before we proceed with this evening's program, I'd like to introduce the evening's platform guests. Also seated on the platform this evening are Melissa Valdez of HALO, Dr. Buddy Gray, Faculty Senate, Cheryl Grice, Classified Senate, Jason Heinrich, SGA Student Body President, Sheila Hockhauser from the Dorothy Thompson Lecture Series, Jim Fleiter of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series, Patricia Hudgens of Black Faculty Staff Alliance, our guest speaker, Lani Guinier, Provost James Kaufman, Kathy Green, co-chair of the MLK Observance Committee, Wayne Nassinger, Distinguished Lecture Series representative, and former mayor of Manhattan, Dick Hayter. Also, we have with us Corey Hall from Black Student Union. It's been said that early bird catches the worm, and so it was in obtaining this year's keynote speaker. Our committee first approached Ms. Guinier in the summer of 1998 to be our keynote speaker for the 2000 celebration. Unfortunately, her agents misunderstood our request to be for 1999 and graciously refused. But persistence does pay off. I requested that a representative reconsider our request and pointed out that our request was for the year 2000, not 1999. And the rest, as they say, is history. I say all that to say that getting Ms. Guinier to Kansas State University was the epitome of the African word ujima, which means collective work and responsibility. Without the collective and responsible work of some very special partners, this event would not have taken place. I'd like to take time out to acknowledge those partners. The University Distinguished Lecturer Series, the Dorothy Thompson Lecture Series, the Lou Douglas Lecture Series, Dean Carol Kellett in the College of Human Ecology, Dean Mike Holan in the College of Education, Dean Yari Badi in the College of Business Administration, Dean Ron Truen from the K-State Graduate School, Dean Peter Nichols in the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Ralph Richardson in the College of Veterinary Medicine, Dean Dennis Law in the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design, Dean Terry King in the College of Engineering, Associate Provost Dr. Maureen Taylor Archer, Office of Diversity and Dual Career Development, Dr. Susan Scott in the Leadership Studies Program. I'd also like to take time out to recognize the members of the MLK Observance Committee for their hard work and dedication in planning and ensuring the success of this week's activities. I'd like to ask the MLK Committee members please stand for a moment. Former Manhattan Mayor Dick Hayter will now make a special presentation to MLK co-chair Kathy Green on behalf of Manhattan Mayor, who could not be in attendance tonight because of the City Commission's regularly scheduled meeting.
It's indeed an honor that I was asked to do this on behalf of our mayor, Mayor Wrights. As you heard, the commission is in session at this time, and so he asked that I convey his congratulations, his greetings, and his regrets that he can't join us this evening, but his message is well conveyed in the proclamation which I will read at this time. Whereas January 17 of the year 2000 marks the observance of the federal legal holiday established by public law to honor the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, and whereas this holiday should serve as the day on, not a day off, a time to honor Dr. King's legacy and contributions to the civil rights movement and to the cause of social justice, and as a focal point for encouraging improved race relations. And whereas this holiday is transformed from being just another day off to a day on, aimed at community service, interracial cooperation, and youth anti-violence initiatives, a day of action and responding to community needs, not a day of apathy or a day of rest and recreation, a day that brings people together to break down the barriers that divide us and work in a united effort to solve our problems through citizen action, a day that brings out the greatness in people by bringing them together to make a difference in their communities. And whereas, in the words of his widow, Coretta Scott King, the greatest gift my husband could receive is if people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds celebrated this holiday by performing individual acts of kindness through service to others. And whereas it is appropriate for the City of Manhattan to support and contribute to the community efforts in the observance of the federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., now therefore I, Roger Wrights, Mayor of the City of Manhattan, Kansas, do hereby proclaim the week of January 15 through 21 of the year 2000 as Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Observance Week in Manhattan, and urge all people to join in observing the birthday of Dr. King on this national holiday and recognizing this day and every day as an opportunity in living in the dream of Dr. King. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now, without further ado, I'd like to ask Provost Kaufman to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Keener. Before I introduce Lani Guinier, I want to thank Keener Tippin and Kathy Green and all their colleagues who've worked so very hard to make the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observance such a success again this year. And in doing so, I just want to comment on what you've already observed, and that is what a classy young man Keener Tippin is. Join me in thanking him. It's a distinct pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Lani Guinier as the University Distinguished Lecturer in Kansas State University's celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's life and message. Lani Guinier is a professor of law at Harvard University, having taught until July 1998 at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. A graduate of Radcliffe College and Yale University Law School, she is a former civil rights lawyer serving with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the U.S. Department of Justice. She has devoted major efforts to revitalizing public discourse in America, including a re-emphasis on multiracial citizen problem solving. She is a recipient of numerous awards and honorary degrees, and her articles have appeared in national law reviews. In 1993, Professor Guinier was nominated by President Clinton for the top civil rights job in the Justice Department. The nomination was withdrawn without an opportunity for a hearing, which she has since created for herself through her written and spoken works. She is the author of The Tyranny of the Majority, Fundamental Fairness and Representative Democracy, a co-author of Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law Schools, and Institutional Change, and author of the 1998 personal and political memoir, Lift Every Voice, Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision of Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming Lani Guinier to the K-State podium.
Thank you very much. Well, I come to you as a worm. Actually, I'm going to talk to you about a canary. So I would like to be both the bird and the worm. But I would first like to pay homage to the man whose life we commemorate this week. And I would like to do so by trying to reclaim the democratic vision that defined not only Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, but the early civil rights movement of which he was such an important part. Now, when I say I want to talk about democracy and I want to reclaim the democratic vision, those of you who studied democracy in high school are already bored. You think that I'm talking about civics, and you think I'm talking about some abstract principle that doesn't really involve you unless you are running for student government or unless you have ambition to be an elected official. And frankly, I'm not sure I'd wish that on anyone these days. What I mean when I talk about democracy doesn't really have a lot to do with electoral politics. It has to do with the ability of people, just like the people in this room, to get together and solve problems that affect their lives. To me, that's what democracy is about. Rule by the people, involving people in making the decisions that affect all of their lives. And involving all of the people has been the great promise of American democracy. And that was one of the things that Dr. King devoted his life to, was allowing African Americans the opportunity to be part of our great democracy. But King also believed, on a very practical level that black political participation was not just important for black people, it was important for all of us. Black participation was crucial to creating a moral force in American politics. Blacks fresh from the movement and deeply conversant with the problems of being excluded could, through their own experience and understanding, morally transform American society in ways that benefited everyone. For example, in one of his books, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King says, and I quote, "American politics needs nothing so much as an injection of the idealism, self-sacrifice, and sense of public service, which is the hallmark of our movement." And in an earlier 1959 speech, Dr. King eloquently gave voice to this theme of listening to the victims in order to transform the society to benefit everyone. He said, "For the Southern Negro is learning to transform his degradation into resistance, non-violent resistance. And by so doing, he is not only achieving his dignity as a human being, he is helping to advance democracy in the South. A new era will open to all Americans. The Negro, in his struggle to secure his own rights, is destined to enlarge democracy for all the people in both a political and a social sense." Destined to enlarge democracy for all the people in both a political and a social sense. Okay, that may still sound a little abstract. So let me try to make it plain through the metaphor of my bird, the canary. I would like to discuss Dr. Martin Luther King's democratic vision and his methodology, not just his dream, in the context of the metaphor of the miner's canary. The miners used to take a canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the miners to stay. The canary's more fragile respiratory system would give way, signaling that the atmosphere in the mines was dangerous, not only for the canary, but for the miners. It is my premise and the point of this lecture tonight to try to make Dr. King's vision and methodology concrete in the context of the issue of affirmative action and the terms of the metaphor, the miner's canary. It is my claim that the experience of people of color, the experience of those who have been underrepresented, the experience of those who have been excluded, the experience of the disabled, the experience of women, these are the experiences of the miner's canary. They are signaling to us that the atmosphere in the mines is toxic, not only for the canaries, but for the miners as well. Unfortunately, however, in this society in the year 2000, we blame the canary. We pathologize the canary. We locate the problem in the canary, and we assume that the solution is simply to fix the canary, to outfit the canary with a little pint-sized gas mask so that it can withstand the toxic atmosphere in the mines. So the theme that I think Dr. King gave his life for, and the theme that I would like to pursue tonight in the context of affirmative action, is the theme of heeding the signal of the canary. Fixing the atmosphere in the mines, not just fixing the canary. And to do this, I would like to start with this idea of democracy in the context of public education in a democracy, and particularly in the context of higher education, where you all are today in a multiracial democracy. And I would like to start the conversation about affirmative action with a conversation first about what is the mission of institutions of higher education in a multiracial democracy. because it is my argument that until we can link issues of admission to mission, we are talking about a problem at the end of the conversation rather than at the beginning. So the mission of institutions of higher education in a democracy is something that we need to talk about. It is not what I think the mission of higher education is. It's not what any individual thinks the mission of higher education is in a democracy. It is the possibility of having a conversation, of bringing people together to start to have a conversation about a problem that affects all of us. Now, obviously, I've given this some thought, and I have some ideas as to what a mission statement or what a mission of an institution might be. And it would, of course, in my view, include the mission of providing knowledge, of giving individuals the opportunity, exposed to great intellectual resources, to develop their intellectual potential, to produce knowledge. I would also assume that the mission of an institution of higher education in a democracy would be to train students to become citizens who are able to support themselves and their families in our economy, particularly in our changing economy. I would think that a mission of an institution of higher education would be to train leaders for the next generation, not only to train citizens, not only to train workers, but to train and nurture leaders, to train people who can work and play well together with others who are not like them, to give people a voice, a critical voice, so that they can participate in the conversation of democracy about all of the public problems that affect them, their family, and the rest of the society. Now, having said that, I don't think that's the end of the conversation. I am putting these ideas out there to invite you to continue to think about what is the mission of an institution of higher education in a multiracial democracy. And it is only when we have that conversation can we then start to worry about what should be the admission requirements for people to participate in this institution, which has as its goal all of these larger projects. And in thinking about how do we link admission to mission, I believe that the experience of people of color, the experience of women, the experience of those who have been left out, the experience of those who have been underrepresented, is the experience of that canary, and that they will help us to see ways in which we can transform the institution so that it realizes, so that it fulfills these missions in a way that not only protects the canary, but makes it possible for the miners to thrive as well. So I want to start with a few easy cases and build up to the hardest case as we go along. These are what I think are the easy cases. Uri Treisman is a professor of calculus. He was a professor of calculus at the University of California at Berkeley, and he noticed that his African-American calculus students were not doing as well in first-year calculus as his Chinese-American calculus students. And he was concerned about this, and so he asked his colleagues why they thought the African-American students were not doing as well in first-year calculus as the Chinese-American students. And his colleagues came back with some of the predictable, stereotypical assumptions, that the African-American students came from single-parent families, that they were not as well prepared, that they were not studying as hard as the Chinese-American students. In other words, locate the problem in the canary. Uri Treisman decided that he wanted to investigate this problem, and so he hired researchers to follow the African American students and the Chinese American students around. And he discovered that his colleagues were wrong. The African American students were studying harder than the Chinese American students if you count studying as sitting in your dormitory room alone with the calculus book wide open in front of you. The Chinese American students, by contrast, were talking calculus one to the other as they walked to the study hall. They were talking calculus over lunch. They were talking calculus in their dormitory rooms. And it was the process of having an intellectual exchange with your peers over a very difficult, conceptually hard subject that enabled the Chinese American students to ask questions, to seek help when they needed help, and to develop the confidence to become active learners. Uri Treisman, seeing what was happening with the Chinese American students, designed a peer workshop in which he invited the African American students to come to solve calculus problems over a table. He served food. He had seen the Chinese American students talking calculus over lunch. He invited recent past learners to come and be available in case the students had questions. And he gave them problems that they were to solve collaboratively. After the first semester of this peer workshop, the African American students' calculus scores went up. By the end of the second semester, the African American students who had attended this peer workshop were among the highest scoring calculus students in the class. Now, you may say, aha, he fixed the Canary. But at that moment, Uri Treisman had an epiphany. The light went on in his head, and he said, if this is the way Chinese American students learn calculus, if this is the way African American students learn calculus, why don't I introduce this into my classroom? I have been teaching calculus as the sage on the stage. I should invite students to solve problems in small groups within the classroom so everyone can learn calculus, so everyone can benefit from the intellectual exchange with their peers, so everyone can learn the confidence of being able to seek help when you need it, when you don't know the answer. And so, at that moment, Uri Treisman learned the lesson of the miner's canary. He took the experience of those who had been not doing that well and used that experience as an infrared light that allowed him to see in the dark. It gave him the ability to see a problem that converged around a particular group, but it was not a problem that was limited only to group members. And as a result, he became a much better calculus teacher for all of his students. Now, to me, that's an easy case. I'll give you another case that I also think is relatively easy. Doesn't involve higher education, but it basically involves the same move in terms of taking the lesson of those on the margin to rethink the whole. In New York City, there were a group of women who challenged the fact that New York City had a height requirement. You had to be 5 feet 10 inches in order to be a police officer in New York City. And these women said this particular height requirement was arbitrary and it was discriminatory. And they succeeded in eliminating the height requirement and brought into the police department women, Latino men, Asian men, and short white men. So they broadened the pool of people who could become police officers, which after all makes sense since police officers are doing a public service, are citizens of a democracy, presumably to help the community to keep the peace. Now, a group of black and Puerto Rican women who came into the department as a result of this decree were assigned to patrol a housing project that was predominantly minority. And these women had not met the height requirement of being 5 feet 10. They were not big. They could not, as a result, function in a very macho way if they were going to keep the peace. So instead of attempting to dominate potential troublemakers, these women reached out to the young adolescent males in the community, identified those who had been in trouble before, and mentored them. They showed them respect. And grateful for the attention of a caring adult, these young men began to constrain their own behavior. The incidence of violent crime in those projects patrolled by these black and Puerto Rican women went down. These women were keeping the peace, but they were changing the way in which police officers think about their job. This is not just the experience of black and Puerto Rican women in the New York City Police Department. After the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles, there was a commission to investigate police brutality. And the Warren Commission reported that if the city of Los Angeles wanted to do something about police misconduct, it should hire more women. Women were willing to draw their weapon, but it was not the first thing that they did. They sought to dissipate conflict first, and only when necessary would they produce a weapon. The argument here is that bringing in people of color, bringing in women, bringing in those who've been excluded is not just the moral thing to do in a democracy. It is also a functional thing to do because those who have been excluded can bring us insight into the way in which some of the practices that we have been engaged in, that we have taken for granted, that we have not questioned, they can show us how those practices are often arbitrary and could be done differently and could be done better. So now let me come to the hard case of affirmative action. And I say it's a hard case, even though I don't believe it's a hard case. I say it's a hard case because the conversation about affirmative action has been so incredibly polarizing that people have already taken sides without having this larger conversation to begin. So I would like to try to reframe this debate, and for those of you who have taken sides, I just ask you to hold your judgment for a moment. Going back to those democratic principles, what is the mission of an institution of higher education in a democracy? I would like us to start to question, what is it that the admission criteria that we presently use have to say about the democratic values that institutions of higher education are supposedly implementing? Well, the first thing that most people say, at least when we're talking about high stakes educational opportunity, admission to an elite university, admission to law school, admission to medical school, you have to be qualified, right? You have to be qualified. Qualified to do what? Qualified to work and play well together with others? Qualified to realize your full intellectual potential? Qualified to become a leader? Qualified to have a critical voice, to be able to participate in the decisions that affect all of us? No, that's not what we mean when we say qualified. We mean that you have to be able to go into a room, take a number 2 pencil, and fill in those bubbles on a timed paper and pencil test. That's what it means to be qualified. Quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information. Turns out that girls, for example, do 40 points worse than boys on the math portion of the SAT. Does that mean they are less qualified? When asked, and it may mean that they haven't been prepared to take math classes in college, except when they get to college and they take math classes, they get the same grades, if not better grades, than the boys. When asked, the girls say that before they put down an answer, they try to work through the problem. Very bad strategy on a timed exam. Quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information does not give you time to work through problems. You must guess. You must play the SAT like the boys do, a pinball machine. Now you may think I'm making all of this up just to prove my point. But it turns out that this qualification that we have elevated to almost religious status in the educational canon does not tell us very much about what we value. Even if what we value is not what I have said we might think about valuing. The biggest claim for this testocracy is that it correlates with first-year grades. It tells us something about who is likely to do well their first year in college, or if they're taking the LSAT, their first year in law school, or if they're taking the MCAT, their first year in medical school. Here's the problem. When people say that something tells you who is going to do well, you generally assume it tells you 9 out of 10 times who's going to do well, 8 out of 10 times. I was a voting rights attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We were trying a number of cases in the South that involved this issue of correlation. And we were trying to show that if you knew the race of a voter in places like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, that 9 out of 10 times you would know the race of the person that they voted for. It's called racial block voting, and in most of the communities in which the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization for which I worked, was filing a lawsuit or bringing a claim, voting was extremely racially polarized. I tried a case, for example, in Phillips County, Arkansas, in which our experts said that in many precincts in which the voters were 100% white, there was not a single vote for the black candidate. Right? So if you knew the race of the voter, you could tell the race of the candidate they voted for. 9 out of 10 times, except that the judge would say, well, where's the other 10%? Right? So if we were going to prove a correlation, we had to show that 10 out of 10 times, if you knew the race of the voter, you could tell who that person was going to vote for. Then I come into law school teaching, and I'm sitting on the admissions committee, and I do a study of the experience of women at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I'm finding that these women are coming in with the identical qualifications as the men, same LSAT, same undergraduate GPA, and yet they're not doing as well in law school. In fact, the men have 3 times as great a chance of being in the top 10% as the women, and 1.5 times as great a chance of being in the top 50% as the women. And so, like Uri Treisman, I go and I ask my colleagues, well, what do you think this might mean? And they come back, well, maybe the women are really not as qualified. It turns out there's this very, very small difference in their LSAT. Statistically insignificant difference in their incoming LSAT. Why don't you go investigate that? That probably explains what's happening to these women in law school. So like Uri Treisman, I went and I investigated it, and what did I find? I found that the LSAT is a terrible predictor of first-year grades for everybody. Everybody, unless you think that a test that predicts the variance in first-year grades 15% of the time is a good predictor. 15% of the time. Where's the other 85%? Harvard did a study of 3 classes of its graduates over a 30-year period, and they found 2 things predicted success as Harvard measured it. Now, Harvard measured success, right? I said we have to start this conversation with what are we trying to do before we decide what it is that we have to use as criteria to admit people that we want to train to do what it is we're trying to do. Harvard said, well, success is measured by how much money do you make, how much fun do you have making the money, and do you give any of it back to Harvard? They called it financial satisfaction, career satisfaction, and community service. 2 things correlated with Harvard's definition of success: low SAT scores and a blue-collar background. Low SAT scores and a blue-collar background. Apparently, the people who were, quote, the least qualified became the most successful. So this idea of what it means to be qualified, in my view, cannot be discussed in the abstract. It has to be situated in a functional view of what it is we're training people to do. So let me tell you now about a study that is about to be published involving the University of Michigan, and I apologize again because it involves law schools, but I happen to be a law professor. I happen to know what's happening in legal education. And like this Harvard study, a group of researchers at the University of Michigan, also Michigan happens to be a public university, and this is a law school which is a public profession. Lawyers are officers of the court. They have a special status in our society. And these researchers looked at all of their graduates since 1970. And lo and behold, they measured success, financial satisfaction, career satisfaction, and community service, but they actually had specific indicia of community service: mentoring younger attorneys, sitting on civic boards, being leaders in your community, doing pro bono work, doing public service work. What did they find? And they had access to the LSATs, the graduate law school records of all of these law students who became lawyers. Those with the highest LSATs were the least likely to do community service. There was, in fact, a relationship between LSAT and community service, and it was a negative relationship. Who was the most likely to do community service? The Black and Latino students who were admitted under their affirmative action program. Now, it was not only that the LSATs did not predict community service, which is something the law school said it valued. It actually had a mission statement that the faculty had passed in 1992 saying, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to train lawyers who will become leaders in their community who will do public service. And yet they relied on an LSAT that had a negative relationship to public service. It also turned out that the LSAT did not predict career satisfaction or financial satisfaction. Again, the only thing the LSAT was good for was predicting, in the case of the University of Michigan, 17.5% of the variance in first-year law school grades. So in order to understand what it means to be qualified, we have to ask, qualified to do what? And if we are saying that qualified to be a lawyer means simply that you are going to do well in your first year of law school, then why do we have 3 years of law school? Now, what's the payoff? If we listen to those canaries, if we look at the experience of the women who became cops, of the African American students who became excellent calculus students, of the African American and Latino students who were admitted pursuant to affirmative action, who became leaders in their community, who mentored younger attorneys, who sat on the boards of community organizations. What can we learn that can transform the institution, transform the educational experience for all of us? Well, the first thing we could learn is that if we are fixed on our present view of the testocracy, we are leaving out many people who don't happen to do well on tests. Now, if we are committed to thinking that those people are unqualified, then we will be satisfied leaving them out. But again, if we are defining qualifications simply in terms of how well they are going to do on a test that doesn't even tell us how well they are going to do first year, except in a very small number of cases, then we are overlooking the potential contribution of many people who could help the larger society. And to give you just one example of this, I'd like to talk about a doctor. And I would like to thank Sharnae Hudgens, who is 8 years old. She's also the daughter of Patricia Hudgens, and who is reading a biography of this same doctor that I want to talk to you about. His name is Dr. Benjamin Carson. Okay? He is the head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. Pretty smart guy. He just finished separating Siamese twins who were joined at the head with their heads looking in opposite directions. He didn't do very well on tests. In fact, he was a terrible student, a troubled young man while he was in elementary school. But his mother's faith in him turned him around, and he ended up going to college, and then he went to the University of Michigan Medical School. His first year in medical school, his faculty advisor said, "You should drop out. You are not medical school material. You are not medical school material. You who can become a pediatric neurosurgeon, you who become the head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, you're not medical school material." Does that suggest that we need to reconnect medical school to the practice of medicine rather than to the practice of MCATs? Dr. Carson pursued his ambition of becoming a doctor because he had good hand-eye coordination, was very, very careful, and thought in 3 dimensions. For him, that meant he was qualified. And it turns out he was right. So if we focus just on these testocratic devices that are used to sort and rank, we may be overlooking the contributions of many people who simply don't do well on those kinds of tests but have enormous contributions to make to the rest of the society. That's one reason that we need to rethink the atmosphere in the minds, heeding the signal of the canary. If we listen to the canary, we may learn how to solve problems differently. Remember those women cops when they came in and didn't have the benefit of being tall and big and dominating. They sought to dissipate conflict, and as a result, the incidence of crime in the project they were patrolling went down. They were introducing all police to a different kind of problem-solving technique. They were helping to redefine the definition, redefine the function of what it means to be a good police officer. Another value, therefore, in my view, of heeding the Canary signal to rethink the way in which our selection criteria need to be embedded, need to be linked, need to be reconnected to the mission of the institution. Now, there is a third reason which I haven't really addressed. And in many ways, I am reluctant to bring up this reason because it seems so pragmatic. And when you think about Dr. Martin Luther King and you think about Dr. Martin Luther King's life, at least I often feel tempted to keep the conversation on this higher moral plane. But Dr. King was also very pragmatic. And one of his arguments was that if we free the Negro, we will also free the larger society. We will free the Negro and free ourselves. So this pragmatic argument as to why we need to heed the signal of the Canary. Right now, we are using these testocratic devices, and I'm not talking about all tests, right? I'm a law professor. I give tests, right? I grade exams. I am not talking about exams that are expressly designed to tell you what you have in fact learned or not learned. I am not talking about achievement tests. I am talking about these standardized aptitude tests that we give to people to decide if in fact they are smart, so then we can decide whether to teach them. Those are the tests that I am referring to. And I am arguing that we are so consumed with our capacity to test that we administer these tests not only when people are trying to become lawyers or doctors or get into a college, but we start administering these tests in kindergarten, in first grade, in second grade, and third grade. We track students based on our assumption that it is only worthwhile to teach people who are already smart, because only smart kids can learn. And as a result, we track one set of kids to college, and we track another set of kids to prison. And that is very costly. Very costly. It's not only costly to the kids who end up in prison, it is costly to all of us. And so I just want to make this very pragmatic argument about the cost of our fascination with the testocracy and why we need to rethink, why we need to use the Canary to rethink these assumptions that are deeply held and thus far unquestioned. For every 5 blacks in California who are in a state institution of higher education, for every 1 black in California who's in a college or university, there are 5 blacks in prison. For every 1 Latino who is in a 4-year institution of higher education, there are 3 Latinos in prison. Now you may say, well, they've committed a crime, they deserve to be in prison. But more and more of our young black and Latino men are being tracked to prison, and we are paying for the failure to intervene earlier in their lives because we've already decided they're not smart because they didn't do well on these tests, so we are not going to invest in teaching them. Jesse Jackson went to Glenbrook South High School right outside of Chicago. And he saw what it's like when you do invest in teaching young people. He saw a beautiful facility, wall-to-wall carpeting. The janitors made $50,000 a year. Everyone had a computer. Cost the taxpayers of Glenbrook South $12,000 a year to provide this first-class education to all of the students, most of whom were white. He then traveled from Glenbrook South to the Cook County Jail in Chicago. Most of the inmates were black or Latino. 90% of them were functionally illiterate. They had not graduated from high school, and it was costing the taxpayers of Chicago $24,000 a year to keep them in prison without teaching them a thing. And I have since learned that it is costing the taxpayers $31,000 a year to keep them in the Cook County Jail. In 1984, going back to California, California spent more than 2.5 times on higher education than it spent on prisons. In 1994, it spent the same, and starting in 1995, it has spent more. The Department of Corrections increased its personnel by 25,864 people, and the higher education personnel dropped by 8,082 people. Now, Victor Hugo said 140 odd years ago, every time we build a prison, we close a school. Judge Norma Shapiro, paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln, said, we are going to end up in a society in which half of us are in prison and the other half are supporting those who are in prison. This is an inefficient way of allocating opportunity in a multiracial democracy. It is costing the taxpayers potential Benjamin Carsons. It is also costing the taxpayers real dollars because we are not able to build institutions of higher education to meet the demand for the skills that higher education gives to all of our citizens in this changing information economy. So I would like to conclude on an optimistic note. I would like to conclude on an optimistic note because I think that when we are open to the lesson of the Canary, we can begin to have a different kind of conversation. This is not just about fixing the Canary. This is about fixing the atmosphere in the minds to benefit all of us. And the reason I'm optimistic about this conversation, in part, is because I am trying to meet the challenge of this century by raising a 12-year-old boy. And one of the things he introduces me to are the movies that he likes. And at one point, he thought he wanted to be an astronaut, so we watched Apollo 13. And I was struck in watching Apollo 13 at the moment when the astronauts were in crisis in their space capsule. There was a problem with the tube that was leading from their breathing into the atmosphere, into the capsule. The tube was round and the valve that was connecting it was square, and there was leakage. And so carbon dioxide was leaking back into the capsule, and they were breathing their own carbon dioxide, and they stood the very strong possibility of a tragedy. And they said, Houston, we have a problem. And the administrator of NASA responded immediately. And he did not say, well, get me the person with the highest math SAT. He brought a group of people into a room. He reproduced what it was that the astronauts had on the space capsule, and he said, now you've got to work together to solve this problem. And he brought people who had different experiences and different expertise. And he said, you've got to solve this problem, and it's too hard for any one person to solve alone. So we've got to learn how to work together to solve this problem. And in the case of the Apollo 13 mission, they did. And they were able to convert what could have been a tragedy into a triumph. And I am confident that if we bring in all of these canaries, and together with the miners, we are open to solving the problem, working and playing well together with people who are different than we are, who bring different expertise and different perspectives, that we too will be able to convert what could have been a tragedy into a triumph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Guinier has agreed to take a few questions. There is a microphone over there and a microphone over there, and if you're in the middle and it's too far to walk, please yell. And so with that, is there a first question? Okay, go ahead. But you have to yell.
Okay, well said. And I think we all agree. I think it's true. Definitely agree with what you said. But these, the tests that you're talking about, and they are working on them, they were made so intentionally. People who lay down the rules have done so intentionally. And what you and I and others are facing that those rules will change. Because our intention is that it's going to be good for everyone. Well, it's going to be good for everyone, but it will not be so good for those for whom it has always been much better than for others. And those for whom it has always been so much better than for others are the ones in power. And appealing to them for the last 2 decades has only resulted in more privilege. I'm not trying to put down all the other successes that you have, but you said yourself that the number of privileges. So what should we be doing practically so that the rules of the game are changed and that the world is made better, not just for the Canary, but for the one?
Better paraphrase the question.
I've been instructed to restate the question. This is a paraphrase. It is not a restatement. How do you get people who have power to give it up? Essentially, the questioner is arguing that the present system of testocracy was implemented intentionally by people for whom that proved to be a benefit. And how do you get people who are invested in their present benefit to share? It's an excellent question. I don't claim to have all of the answers, but I have a few ideas. One idea is that the argument for the testocracy, what some people will call the meritocracy, although I just learned that the term meritocracy was the invention of a British sociologist in 1958. We think that America has always been a meritocracy. It's a British sociologist's satire, right? He came up with the term as a way of poking fun at a system of rules in which those who win and those who lose are convinced of the rightness of the decision. Those who win and those who lose, right? Very clever system. Now, one of the ways in which you change things is to convince the losers that they don't deserve to lose, right? Because the system works only because the losers are not challenging it. The losers are saying, hey, I'm stupid. I don't belong in the upper ranks of power. So one idea, use a lottery, right? People say, well, we need to have this test because it's efficient. It's a way to administer a system for allocating privilege objectively. A lottery would do the same thing, right? Now, problem with the lottery is it's arbitrary. So is the present system. And the advantage of a lottery is that those who lose realize that they are unlucky, not that they are stupid. So my view is if you're unlucky, you might be more willing to challenge the system that excluded you in the first place. Maybe you would organize to get the legislature to build more schools. And an argument for the lottery is that it would include people who had previously been lucky, people who have resources, who have the experience of pushing the legislature on other issues. Another way in which you get those in power to share their power was done in Texas with this 10% plan. After the Fifth Circuit ruled that affirmative action was unconstitutional, a group of Latino and Black professors, community activists, and legislators got together and said, well, if we can't use affirmative action to prop up the testocracy, because that's essentially the relationship between the two, right? The testocracy is unfair to many people. It turns out, one of the things I didn't speak about, but the testocracy tells us more about the past than the future. One of the best predictors of your performance on these standardized aptitude tests is your grandparents' socioeconomic status. Your grandparents' socioeconomic status tells us how well you're going to do on the SAT. Because coaching and being able to take vacations, go to the library, have lots of books at home, these are things that are being related to or tapped into by the SAT. But it doesn't tell us, are you motivated like those blue-collar, low SAT scoring students at Harvard to take advantage of an opportunity and run with it? It doesn't tell us whether you have drive. It doesn't tell us whether you have initiative. So one of the things that the professors, activists, and legislators in Texas said is, hey, this is a public school. It's a public university. All the taxpayers of Texas are subsidizing it. Let's look at who has been going to the University of Texas, to Texas A&M. Turns out that a group of suburban schools outside of Houston, outside of Dallas, were the primary feeder schools to the two flagship state institutions. And yet, poor and working class whites in the rural part of Texas were paying for the education of these middle and upper class suburban kids. So they said, well, if what we're looking for are people with initiative, people who can show persistence over time, why don't we look at their high school grades rather than their test scores? And they introduced a plan that anyone in the top 10% of their high school graduating class from any place in the state would be automatically eligible for admission to the University of Texas, Austin, or Texas A&M. They got this past the legislature. Governor George W. Bush signed the legislation. It is now the law in Texas. And they have been producing data about the performance of the 10%ers at the University of Texas. They've now finished a full year of freshmen who were admitted pursuant to the top 10% plan. The 10%ers have a higher GPA at the University of Texas than their predecessors. So I'm not saying everyone should have a 10% plan. This has to be functional. It has to make sense in the context of the mission of the institution and the particular goals that you are trying to accomplish. But in Texas, at least for the time being, the 10% plan has transformed the admission criteria at the university. How do you do this in other contexts? Sometimes you have to think about converting from a zero-sum, winner-take-all idea to sharing power, to taking turns. One of the things that has been done at a number of schools, including the University of Minnesota, again another public institution, is to use the junior colleges and the community colleges as feeder schools, making it possible for everyone to go to the community college and the junior college, but once you go there, if you do well, you don't have to repeat courses when you get into the four-year college. You are given credit for the work you have done in the two-year college or in the junior college, so that it is a way of opening up opportunity without threatening directly those people who already have opportunity. So there are lots of ways of thinking about this problem. I don't think I have thought of all of the ways, but I would challenge you to keep thinking about this problem, because this is the central problem. How do we share power? And in a democracy, that is one of the most important values, sharing power. We don't believe in having a permanent elite in a democracy. That's the difference between a monarchy or an aristocracy and a democracy. So the last point I would make in response to this question is that the legitimacy of those who presently have power is at stake. And they will have to find ways to continue to, quote, reign in peace by expanding opportunity so it does not appear that they are simply hoarding and perpetuating their own privilege. I filibustered so long she left.
I've got a question of my own.
Great.
But I'd like you to take your approach to standardized tests and apply them to the following scenario. In a predominantly white male environment, academic environment, we have two candidates for an open assistant professor position in the final pool. One, a majority candidate, has published his dissertation, has one additional refereed paper in print, and two more in press and one in review, and has his first grant. Another candidate in this predominantly or exclusively white environment may have published her dissertation, have two papers in press and one under review, and have one grant application out that has made the first cut. And similar to the standardized tests, the standardized rules of this game are that the first candidate is the most qualified. And that's where the selection is then driven to. Would you comment on the conceptual relationship between those situations?
Okay. I've actually confronted this problem. I'm on the entry-level admissions committee at Harvard Law School, and we have many white male candidates who come in, and we are now talking about entry-level teaching positions, right? People who are being hired to become teachers, not people who've already been teaching. And we have people who've been teaching for 7 years applying for an entry-level teaching position. We have people who've published books applying for an entry-level teaching position. Now, the question is, what does it mean to be qualified? What is it that we are looking for in expanding our faculty? And this is a question I constantly put to my colleagues. It is my view that you cannot compare everyone on a single metric. You cannot say everyone has to be exactly the same on these 5 things, because you will then end up with the problem that you've just described. My view is that you have to say, what is the primary need of this particular department at this particular time? What is it that we are missing? What is it that we need? What is it that our students are missing? What is it that our students could benefit from if we were to add to our faculty? And so in my view, one of the ways to look at this problem is what are the respective strengths that each of these candidates is going to bring to our department or to our faculty. And if one of them is going to bring a whole new way of thinking about things, a whole new perspective, that is a strength that cannot be reproduced simply because somebody already has a grant application that's been approved. Now, there are some people who are excellent teachers and not very good scholars. And there are some people who are excellent scholars and not quite as good teachers. And I think that we have to have both. We have to invite the people who are great scholars to come in and write their scholarship, but we cannot sacrifice our students to have a whole faculty of great scholars and no teachers. So the challenge is to identify, and this is, you cannot decide this in the abstract. You cannot decide it by saying, what is the metric that we are using? When I was on the admissions committee at the University of Pennsylvania, and we were doing what was then called special admissions. These were people, half of the class at the University of Pennsylvania Law School was admitted based solely on the numbers. They gave you a number, an index score based on your college grades, your law school, LSAT, and the median LSAT of all of the people who had gone to college with you. Right? So it wasn't just your LSAT, but all of the people who took the LSAT from your college. That went into your number. That, in fact, was what, in the case that I referred to that led the Fifth Circuit to declare the affirmative action program at the University of Texas unconstitutional. That is what, in fact, had happened to Cheryl Hopwood, the plaintiff in that particular case. This was a white woman who said there were 63 out of 92 black and Mexican American admittees who had lower Texas index scores than she did. And therefore she said she had been excluded on the basis of her race. Fact of the matter is there were 140 white students who had lower Texas index scores than she did. But the reason that she didn't identify this is because we are so used to thinking about everything in black, white, racial terms, nobody bothered to look at the white students. And what they would have found is that the problem for Cheryl Hopwood is that she had gone to a state and a community college, and the median LSAT at those two institutions had pulled down her own index. So she was being disadvantaged for not going to a more prestigious institution with more upper income applicants. Okay, well, coming back now to this, when I was at Penn, 50% of the class was admitted simply on the numbers. They didn't even read all of those letters that you had your professors write. They did not read your personal statement. They had an administrator, after you had been provisionally admitted, read your application to make sure you had not committed a crime or had done something else that would embarrass the institution. Okay, so then you had to admit the other 50%. That was my job, right? The special admissions. And we would meet in a committee and we would read all of these applications and then we would have a conversation. And we would discuss, why did we think we should admit this particular person? And some people would push a particular agenda, and some people would have very quirky and idiosyncratic views. But it was the process of having this deliberation that really allowed us to bring a very diverse and interesting group of students into the school. And it was those students who were generally the most interesting students in the classroom. They enriched the environment for everyone. Now, if we had said, oh, but we have to use a single metric to admit everyone, we would have had a group of very boring students. Right? We had chicken farmers from Alabama, and they had real-world experience to bring to a conversation about criminal law. If we didn't have the, quote, special admissions, we would have had a lot of very young people who had come straight out of college, had never lived in the real world, and when you asked them about a problem, would be waiting for you to tell them the answer. Right? Because that's part of the problem with the whole testocracy, is it socializes you not to think critically. That's also a bad thing if you're being timed and graded on this paper and pencil test. The idea is to anticipate what it is that the test maker is looking for. So don't think, guess. So coming back to this problem, my view is there's no single right answer. It is a functional view of merit, and it has to make sense in the context of the challenges that the particular institution is facing at that particular moment.
Last question.
Okay, and do you want to use the microphone?
This either needs to be the last one or we need two quick ones. You guys are there together working out.
Jeb Bush is trying to do that in Florida. And part of the difficulty with the concept is that some of the schools that have been desegregated, with a lot of the cases that you're familiar with, are now being resegregated. So when you have the upper, they're using 20% down there. When you have the 20% or the 10%, the students aren't prepared to go into the University of Texas, the University of Miami, or the University of Florida, because their teachers and the course offering where you have 40% of the teachers are teaching out of their area don't equip these kids to compete as first-year students. Okay, then the second part of an observation that's happening recently is that some of the upper middle class individuals are declaring their students, or not their students, their children, as special education students. So when they can't pass the test, they get a longer time to take the same test that are excluding the disabled individuals.
Okay, well, you're actually talking about two very different problems. In Texas, as I suggested, students are coming from vastly different backgrounds to the University of Texas. You have people coming from rural West Texas, you have people coming from San Antonio and area of Texas that is almost 90% Mexican American. And those 10%ers are doing better than their predecessors at the University of Texas after their first year. So a lot of our fears that people who are ill-prepared are not going to be able to compete have been proven wrong, at least in Texas, because being well prepared is not simply about how much information have you been able to store in your brain. In the information economy, you simply cannot store all of the information that you need in your brain. It is about knowing how to retrieve information, and it is about having the motivation to go and do research. And so part of what having a good grade suggests is that you are motivated to excel whatever the circumstances. You may be right that there's a transitional period. I talked, for example, to a group of professors of biology, chemistry, and physics at Haverford. This is now a private elite school in Pennsylvania, and they were concerned because a lot of black students were failing the first year of chemistry and therefore not proceeding to take the full course of chemistry. But they said when students, even after they failed the first year of chemistry or did very poorly, continued, they overcame whatever deficit they had. So I suggested, why don't you have the first year of chemistry pass-fail? Why don't you have it over a longer period of time? Why don't you reduce the pressure to succeed in your freshman year so that you give students who haven't had the preparation, haven't had the lab work, haven't had access to the resources, a chance to catch up, because by the time they become sophomores and juniors, they do. Why do we privilege those people who come well prepared and then do nothing compared to those people who are less well prepared but are really hard and diligent students? So they actually thought that was a good idea. Now, in terms of the special education situation, that has to do with, in my view, another miner's canary. When you have a person who has a learning disability or has dyslexia or cannot compete in a timed fashion, they need more time to answer the questions. Makes sense. Why not give everyone more time to answer the questions, right? Why should you put such a premium on time? To me, they're a canary. They're saying, hey, giving people 3 hours to answer this question is simply an arbitrary way of making speed do all the work for us. So people who think fast are somehow privileged. People who don't do research are somehow privileged. People who don't think through problems before they put down an answer are somehow privileged. Why do we value speed? Certainly, if we need someone to make a precision decision with no opportunity to do research, let's have somebody who's very speedy on our team. But not every decision requires a speedy response. And in fact, you want a team that includes thoughtful people who take 24, 48 hours to reflect, to ask other people for their opinion, to collaborate. We have this very perverse view of efficiency in this society that if you can't do it right away, it's not worth doing. So I see the learning disabled issue as a miner's canary. And I think that, unfortunately, the way we are now looking at it, it's an exception from the rule only for people who can make the claim. And what you're pointing out is that the people who tend to make the claim tend to be the children of wealthy parents who know how to manipulate the system. So you have, for example, among those in California again, who have been eligible to get an exemption from the 3-hour test to take it in 4 hours or 5 hours on the grounds that they're learning disabled, 68% or some enormous percentage of white males who come from affluent families where the families earn over $100,000 a year. And yet 68% of white males who are in the pool do not come from such affluent families. So you have a disproportionate number of people, and this goes back to your point about power, people who know how to manipulate the system seeing, aha, here's an exception that I can now use to my advantage. So my view is open up the exception to everybody, saying, we're going to give you this LSAT and you can take all day. Right? You can even study. I give my students take-home exams, open book, and the last thing I've done is I said, you can take the exam with 2 or 3 other people. Just hand in one exam and make sure you all agree on the answers. Now you may say, well, that's cheating. That's how lawyers work, right? When you are, and I don't mean that lawyers cheat. I mean lawyers collaborate. When you have a brief to write, you don't sit in some secret little room with your partners excluded and say, well, you can't look at my answer. You write a draft and you share it with them and you ask them to do part of it and you ask them to comment and criticize and suggest other cases that you might think about. You've got to be able to work with other people if you're a lawyer. So we should stop thinking that the goal of education is to identify who is smart based on a very arbitrary set of criteria that privilege speed and working in isolation from either the facts or from other people as our preeminent values. Thank you very much.
Hang on just a minute. I would remind you there's a book signing in the lobby at the conclusion of this discussion, and Kathy Green has a presentation if you would care to come on up. I just got to say, Professor Guinier, that your colleagues at Harvard Law need to understand how much greater impression you make than Alan Dershowitz on their behalf. Kathy Green.
Lani Guinier, would you please step forward? On behalf of the Martin Luther King Observance Week Committee, we'd like to present you this memento of your visit to Kansas State University, and we certainly appreciate your celebrating part of the week with us and paying tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he certainly would have been proud hearing your speech tonight.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank all of you.